On Saturday morning, Donald Trump posted an ultimatum on Truth Social. He wrote that if Iran does not fully open the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours, the United States will hit and obliterate Iranian power plants, starting with the biggest one first. Iran's military responded within hours. Tehran declared it is ready to close the Strait of Hormuz indefinitely if that threat is carried out. Not temporarily, indefinitely. Two governments, two statements, one 48-hour window. And buried inside the same news cycle, a decision from Trump's own Treasury Secretary that directly contradicts everything the ultimatum is supposed to signal. In the next 10 minutes, we are going to explain what hitting Iranian power plants actually means, why the administration unsanctioned Iranian oil the same week it threatened to obliterate Iranian infrastructure, and what the gap between those two decisions tells you about the real state of this war that neither side is publicly admitting. First, the geography and the stakes. Because obliterating power plants sounds like a military operation, it is not. Iran's electricity grid serves approximately 85 million people. It runs hospitals, water treatment facilities, food refrigeration, communications infrastructure, and the civilian population of a country that has already absorbed over 7,000 airstrikes in 23 days. The UN World Food Program warned before this conflict that a sustained energy disruption in Iran would trigger cascading food security failures across the region. The European Council has already issued a formal call for a moratorium on strikes against energy and civilian infrastructure. Destroying Iran's largest power plant would not degrade a military capability. It would collapse civilian life in a country of 85 million people and hand Tehran a political and humanitarian narrative that would fracture the already thin international coalition supporting this campaign. The largest power plant in Iran is the Bushehr nuclear power plant. It sits on the Persian Gulf coast, approximately 340 kilometers south of Tehran. It was built with Russian assistance. It is the only operational nuclear power plant in the country. Striking a nuclear power plant, regardless of whether it houses a weapons program, crosses a threshold that no NATO ally has publicly endorsed and that multiple international legal frameworks explicitly prohibit. If Trump's threat refers to Bushehr, he is threatening to strike a Russian-built nuclear facility. If it refers to one of Iran's major thermal power plants, the humanitarian consequences are catastrophic. Neither interpretation is a clean military option, and yet the ultimatum was posted from Mar-a-Lago on a Saturday with no apparent coordination with allies. Now here is the detail that makes this ultimatum internally incoherent, and this is the part the mainstream coverage has almost entirely missed. Stay with me. On Friday night, the same week Trump was preparing to post his power plant ultimatum, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced that the administration had granted a temporary license allowing Iran to sell 140 million barrels of oil currently sitting on tankers at sea. 140 million barrels of Iranian crude, temporarily unsanctioned, by the government that is simultaneously threatening to destroy Iranian infrastructure. The stated reason was to ease surging global oil prices. Brent crude had closed at $112 a barrel, its highest level since July 2022. The national average for a gallon of regular gasoline in the United States reached $3.91, the highest since October 2022. Drivers across the country have collectively paid nearly $4.5 billion more at the pump since February the 28th. Goldman Sachs told clients this week that elevated oil prices could persist through 2027. Those are the numbers that explain why a country threatening to obliterate enemy infrastructure simultaneously lifted sanctions on that enemy's oil exports. Because the economic consequences of this war are now creating domestic political pressure severe enough to force policy decisions that directly contradict the military posture. Beth Sanner, former Deputy Director of National Intelligence, said at a CNN town hall this week that the administration is trying to do little tiny things that make it seem like they are doing something to bring prices down. She assessed that lifting sanctions on Iranian oil would not meaningfully increase the number of barrels on the market. The gesture was political. The problem is structural. And the structural problem is the Strait of Hormuz. Approximately 20% of the world's daily oil supply passes through a waterway that is 40 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Since February the 28th, Iran has reduced daily transit traffic from over 120 vessels to near zero. 22 countries, including Bahrain, several EU nations, Japan, and Canada have signed a joint statement supporting efforts to reopen the strait. But signing a statement and committing naval assets are two different things. Trump called NATO allies cowards this week for not sending warships. The UK said it is working with allies. France's Macron said he would consult the UN Security Council, but only after fighting subsides. Australia and Japan said they are not sending ships. The physical coalition needed to reopen Hormuz by force does not currently exist. Iran's military understands this. Their response to the ultimatum was not just a threat to close Hormuz indefinitely. A senior Iranian source told CNN that Tehran is now moving forward with monetizing control of the waterway. Monetizing. Not blockading as a military tactic, not closing as a pressure lever. Treating Hormuz as an economic instrument with a price attached. That is a fundamentally different posture. It means Iran sees a long game that extends well beyond the military phase of this conflict. It means they believe they can sustain control of the waterway long enough to extract something from it that has economic rather than purely military value. The 48-hour ultimatum was issued into this context, not from a position of unchallenged dominance. From a position of mounting domestic economic pressure, a fragmenting international coalition, an ally that is simultaneously saying strikes will increase significantly this week, while Washington is saying it is considering winding down. And an adversary that absorbed 3 weeks of the most intense bombing campaign in the modern Middle East, and responded by firing missiles at cities near Israel's nuclear research center, and at a U.S. base 2,500 miles away in the Indian Ocean. Trump said this week that the U.S. has blown Iran off the map, that Iran's leadership is gone, its Navy and Air Force are dead, and they have absolutely no defense. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper said Iran retains only 8% of its original missile capability. If those assessments are accurate, the ultimatum is unnecessary. A country with no defense and 8% of its missiles does not need to be given 48 hours to comply. It complies. The fact that an ultimatum was necessary at all, the fact that Hormuz remains effectively closed, the fact that Iran is still launching missiles at Israeli cities and Indian Ocean bases with its remaining 8%, tells you something important about the gap between the public narrative of this war and its operational reality. Here is what the expectations were when this ultimatum was issued and what the reality has already demonstrated. The expectation was that a country operating on 8% of its missile inventory and described as having no defense would be in no position to resist an ultimatum from the world's largest military. The reality is that Iran responded to the ultimatum by threatening to permanently close the most important oil shipping lane on the planet. The expectation was that lifting sanctions on Iranian oil was a temporary market stabilization measure with no political cost. The reality is that it signals the administration privately believes the economic consequences of this war are severe enough to require revenue relief for the enemy it is publicly claiming to have defeated. The expectation was that the 48-hour deadline would force a Hormuz concession. The reality is that Iran's military announced within hours that a Hormuz closure could become permanent, not temporary, if the threat is carried out. The expectation was that the international community would rally behind Washington to enforce the ultimatum. The reality is that the coalition of 22 countries who signed a statement has not produced a single confirmed naval commitment. 3 things can happen when the clock expires. Trump carries out the threat. Iran closes Hormuz permanently. The energy crisis goes from serious to catastrophic, and the international pressure on Washington becomes unmanageable. Trump allows the deadline to pass without action. The credibility of every future American threat in this conflict is destroyed, and Iran's calculation that Washington is constrained by its own economic exposure is confirmed. Or Iran makes a partial gesture, enough for Trump to claim progress without full compliance. Both sides step back from the immediate brink, and the war continues at a lower temperature while nothing is resolved. Which of those 3 do you think is actually going to happen? Drop it in the comments. This is Global Conflicts Dispatch. Subscribe. Back tomorrow.